You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon, and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Introduction. In 1933, the German government passed a new law known as the Enabling Act, which essentially granted the German cabinet, and particularly Chancellor Adolf Hitler, the authority to create and enforce laws without needing the approval of Germany's parliament, the Reichstag, or the then president, Paul von Hindenburg. This law drastically altered the balance of power in the government and set the stage for the emergence of Nazi Germany. When Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, an early crisis, the Reichstag fire, occurred the following month. Hitler blamed communists for the fire and used it as a pretext to convince President Hindenburg to issue the Reichstag fire decree. This decree suspended many fundamental civil liberties and allowed the Nazis to suppress political opposition violently. Claiming the decree was not enough, Hitler pushed for the Enabling Act, which would give him and his cabinet even more extensive powers, essentially sidelining Germany's constitution. The Enabling Act's passage wasn't certain at first, as the Nazis didn't win an outright majority in the Reichstag during the March elections, which took place amid political violence and intimidation by Nazi forces. However, through a combination of threats, bargaining, and manipulation, Hitler secured the necessary support for the act from various conservative and nationalist groups. Once the act was in place, it was used to establish Dachau, the first Nazi concentration camp, and to eliminate all significant political opposition. The Enabling Act was swiftly adopted by Parliament on March 23, 1933, and signed by Hindenburg on the same day. Designed to last 4 years unless renewed, the act etched Hitler's dictatorship into German law and facilitated the Nazis' rise to unchecked power. By July, the Nazi Party was the only legal political party, and all other parties had been dissolved, relegating the Reichstag to merely endorsing Hitler's decisions. This passage of the Enabling Act is pivotal in history, as it marked the Weimar Republic's end and the formal beginning of the Third Reich, Hitler's totalitarian Nazi regime. The act paved the way for Hitler to eliminate internal party rivals and non-compliant officials through actions like the Night of the Long Knives, securing his supreme authority over Germany. The unchecked power gained from the act allowed Hitler to aggressively rearm Germany and pursue foreign policy goals that would lead to World War II. The Enabling Act was annulled after Nazi Germany capitulated to Allied forces in 1945 and was officially repealed by the Allied occupation authorities later that year. Background. Shortly after becoming Germany's chancellor on January 30, 1933, Hitler requested President von Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag, which led to the scheduling of an election on March 5, 1933. In a clandestine gathering at Hermann Göring's Reichstag presidential palace residence, Hitler and 20 to 25 business tycoons discussed funding for the Nazi Party's election campaign. The subsequent Reichstag fire was exploited by the Nazis to claim a looming communist uprising. Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to enact the Reichstag fire decree, drastically reducing German civil liberties and freedoms in the media and legal processes a mere 5 days before the vote. Utilizing the decree, Hitler targeted the Communist Party by raiding their offices and detaining their leaders, thereby nullifying their electoral influence. Despite increasing their vote tally by 5 million from the earlier election, the Nazis did not secure a parliamentary majority and relied on their alliance with the German National People's Party, which won 8% of the seats, to hold a slender combined majority of 52%. To rid himself of reliance on this coalition, Hitler and his cabinet, after the election on March 15th, began planning an Enabling Act. This act would grant the cabinet the authority to legislate for 4 years without the Reichstag's input or the need to alter existing coalition arrangements. Unlike Stalin, who overhauled his country's constitution, Hitler chose not to replace the Weimar Constitution, which remained theoretically active until the end of World War II in 1945, when Germany's sovereignty was terminated. In order to pass the Enabling Act, seen as a constitutional amendment due to its potential to modify the Constitution, a 2/3 majority in the Reichstag was necessary. This required two-thirds of the duly elected representatives to be present for the vote. Anticipating opposition from the Social Democrats, SPD, and Communists, KPD, the government had already detained many of these members under the pretext of the Reichstag fire decree. The Nazis expected favorable votes from other parties disenchanted with the Weimar Republic's instability. To ensure a two-thirds majority, Hitler relied on the Center Party's cooperation and had discussions with the party's leader, Ludwig Kaas, a Catholic priest. By March 22nd, they reached an understanding based on assurances for the Center Party's survival, religious freedoms, and job security for party-affiliated civil servants. It's argued by some, like scholar Klaus Scholder, that Hitler had agreed to work towards an accord with the Vatican, represented by Kaas's associate Cardinal Pacelli, later Pope Pius XII. This agreement aimed to secure the Catholic Church's position in Germany. Despite the lack of evidence linking the Enabling Act to the later Concordat, signed on July 20, 1933, Kaas went to Rome after the Enabling Act passed to explore the potential for a church-state treaty. Full text. As with most of the laws passed in the process of Gleichschaltung, the Enabling Act is quite short, especially considering its implications. The full text in English follows. Law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich. The Reichstag has enacted the following law, which is hereby proclaimed with the assent of the Reichsrat, it having been established that the requirements for a constitutional amendment have been fulfilled. Article 1. In addition to the procedure prescribed by the Constitution, laws of the Reich may also be enacted by the Government 24 of the Reich. This includes the laws referred to by Articles 85, Paragraph 2, and Article 87 of the Constitution. Article 2. Laws enacted by the government of the Reich may deviate from the Constitution as long as they do not affect the institutions of the Reichstag and the Reichsrat. The rights of the President remain unaffected. Article 3. Laws enacted by the Reich government shall be issued by the Chancellor and announced in the Reich Law Gazette. They shall take effect on the day following the announcement, unless they prescribe a different date. Articles 68 to 77 of the Constitution do not apply to laws enacted by the Reich government. Article 4. Treaties of the Reich with foreign states, which relate to matters of Reich legislation, shall for the duration of the validity of these laws not require the consent of the legislative authorities. The Reich government shall enact the legislation necessary to implement these agreements. Article 5. This law enters into force on the day of its proclamation. It expires on the 1st of April 1937. It expires furthermore if the present Reich government is replaced by another. Meaning: provisions contained in Articles 1 and 4 of the discussed legislation granted the German government powers to create the national budget, ratify international agreements, and formulate laws without needing the participation or consultation of the Reichstag. According to the traditional legal interpretations in Germany prior to 1933 and after the end of World War II, such laws would normally be subjected to a vote within the cabinet, where a majority decision would determine their passage, though this process wasn't adhered to under the conditions described. Article 3 highlights the role of the Chancellor, which is significant to note. Before this period, the government often resorted to using the emergency powers outlined in Article 48, which required the decisions to be made by the President. Additionally, the President was responsible for the formal promulgation of laws that were passed through standard procedures. In contrast, the implementation of laws under the Enabling Act removed any need for presidential involvement, marking an unprecedented period in German history where the head of state had no hand in the legislative process up until the point where Hitler assumed the role of president in 1934. Passage. Discussions within the Center Party continued up until the voting date, March 23, 1933. The party's leader, Kaas, was in favor of endorsing the act, hoping for a promised guarantee from Hitler, while the ex-chancellor, Brüning, argued against it. In the end, the majority sided with Kaas, and Brüning relented to keep party unity, also supporting the act. The Reichstag's president, Hermann Göring, manipulated the procedural rules to ensure the bill's passage. Normally, a two-thirds majority of the Reichstag was needed to discuss a constitutional change, which in this case would have required 432 out of 647 deputies. However, Göring calculated the quorum at just 378 by disregarding the communist KPD deputies, who had been arrested or were in hiding following the Reichstag fire decree. Although the KPD had not been immediately outlawed, its members' arrests following the fire at the Reichstag suggested a de facto ban, with the excuse that they were accountable for the arson. Göring even decreed that absent members would count as present, a move meant to counteract any resistance. When the time for the vote arrived, the atmosphere was menacing, with the SA occupying the Reichstag. Hitler gave a speech tailored to reassure the Center Party, including almost verbatim the concessions Kaas had sought. Kaas expressed his party's support, and Brüning remained quiet. The only open objection came from Otto Wels, the SPD chairman. Despite his understanding with Hitler, Kaas did not receive the written constitutional assurances he had been promised when the vote started. The pressure was immense, with most deputies already backing the bill and potential dissenters intimidated by the SA's presence. Ultimately, all parties except the SPD endorsed the Enabling Act. With repression and absence thinning the SPD's ranks, the vote passed with a staggering 444 in favor versus 94 against. The aggressive and coercive circumstances of the vote meant that the act would have passed with a sizable majority even if all SPD deputies had been present. Later that day, the Reichsrat followed suit, approving the act without debate and with a unanimous vote. Following this, the act was signed by President Hindenburg and key ministers, turning it into law. Thus, the Enabling Act was adopted, which effectively marked a crucial step in the establishment of Hitler's dictatorship, as it gave his cabinet the power to enact laws without the Reichstag's further involvement. Consequences. The government had been granted the power to create laws without needing approval from Parliament or being subject to its oversight, which allowed them to bypass the Constitution, save for a few exceptions. This authority effectively sidelined the Reichstag in German political affairs. Although the Reichstag remained officially in existence, as protected by the Enabling Act, it essentially became a venue for Hitler to give speeches, rarely convening until the end of World War II, with no significant debates or legislative activity. Within 3 months of the Enabling Act being passed, all other political parties had been dissolved or coerced into disbanding, leaving the Nazi Party as the sole legal political entity in Germany as per Hitler's earlier vow to eliminate all other parties. While there was initially an agreement for a committee to keep the Reichstag parties informed about legislation enacted under the new powers, the committee, co-led by Hitler and the Center Party chairman Kaas, turned out to be ineffective and irrelevant as it met infrequently and had little influence. After the Enabling Act's passage, Hitler effectively exercised complete legislative control, with formal cabinet deliberations ceasing and cabinet meetings tapering off until they stopped altogether after 1938. Hitler was careful to maintain a veneer of legality for his regime, which led to the Enabling Act being renewed in 1937 and 1941, though this was a mere formality since no other parties existed. Elections were a sham, offering voters a single list of candidates aligned with the Nazis. By 1942, Hitler had extended his power to the extent that a new law gave him authority over the life and death of every citizen, further solidifying his control. Interestingly, some of Hitler's actions in 1934 seemed to contradict the Enabling Act. He abolished the Reichsrat and centralized state powers, even though the act stipulated the protection of both legislative chambers. Furthermore, Hitler assumed the presidential powers upon Hindenburg's death, despite the act's provisions for the presidency to remain undisturbed, an action which was not constitutionally in line with the presidential succession at the time, and went unchallenged in court. After Germany's defeat in World War II, the Allied Control Council officially declared the Enabling Act void. In post-war West Germany, the Constitution adopted in 1949, Article 9, allows for the banning of organizations deemed hostile to the constitutional order. Importantly, only the Federal Constitutional Court has the power to brand political parties as enemies of the Constitution, Article 21. This was established to prevent the recurrence of an authoritarian rule, such as what resulted from the Enabling Act of 1933, by upholding the Constitution's core principles. Validity. In the book, The Coming of the Third Reich, historian Richard J. Evans claims that the Enabling Act, which contributed to Hitler's rise to dictatorial power, was not passed through legal means. He explains that Hermann Göring, a leading figure in the Nazi Party, had no legal grounds to reduce the number of members needed for a voting quorum, which was necessary to discuss a bill that would alter the Constitution. While only 2/3 of the members in attendance were needed to approve the bill, the presence of 2/3 of all members of the Reichstag was required to even begin the process of considering a constitutional change. Evans points out that although it wasn't necessary to include the Communist Party deputies for the actual vote tally of the Enabling Act, their numbers should have been considered when determining whether the requisite quorum was met. Göring's failure to do so was, according to Evans, illegal. Furthermore, Evans posits that even in the face of intimidation that filled the voting session, the Enabling Act would still have passed with a notable majority, with an absolute minimum of 68.7% support. Evans also criticizes the validity of the approval process in the Reichsrat, the legislative body representing German states, stating that the preconditions for a proper vote had been compromised. He claims that because of the Reichstag fire decree, the state governments were not in their proper form nor correctly represented. This rendered the passage of the Enabling Act in the Reichsrat not only irregular, but also potentially illegitimate.